Delicate subject. Chapter 6. Emergencies arrived on the lack of schedule. Tally needed to be cleared of treason allegations, which made no sense. In discussion with Tally, she had no idea what the accusations were, only that she'd been asked to report to the flotilla. Of course they'd go. Tired, wired, angry, and hating Geth only slightly more than Quarians, Jane fought her way through the Alarai with Garrus and Tally. Jane felt crowning fury at the insult to injury aimed at Tally. Treason. Exile. Her father's ship taken with him on board. When they found his body, she pulled Tally into her arms. They were both shaken, Tally from loss and Jane from anger on her friend's behalf. Tally had always been a particular type of fragile, like a spiderweb spangled with dew and sun, beautiful and intricate in the way that caught the light and held the attention. Spider silk was one of the strongest materials in existence. A miracle. Tally was a miracle. Jane didn't tell the admirals about Tally's father, though the man deserved to be dragged and drowned after what he had done. What Jane did was for Tally. The Quarians didn't deserve the truth because all they would do was twist it. Jane didn't lie. She was just so damned angry that she was about ready to point the new Thanix cannon at this ship and blow it away. Do the galaxy some good. Would it be so bad if a few Reapers came after the Quarians? Yes. Yes, it would. It didn't seem that way, but... yes, it would. Because Tally wouldn't like it. Jane closed her eyes and imagined the Thanix ripping through the flotilla, and then calmed some of her bloodlust. Calriga and Vitor stood up for her. Vitor, who couldn't stand up for anything otherwise. Nervous, twitchy Vitor was the hero today. That was courage. Jane calmed, relaxing the tight hold she had on her fist as they gave their final verdict, allowing Tally to stay in their ranks. She's mine. Even her name says so now. You guys don't deserve her. She didn't need to slaughter anybody else today. Tally, Garrus, and she had Geth ichor splattered all over them. Tears choked Tally's voice, and Garrus dearly wanted to let Tally lean on him through this. Instead, he stood, stoic and intimidating, with none of this showing on his face. The only sign was that he was close to Tally, leaning toward her. What might look like aggression to an outsider was the will to protect her from this, shield her. In the calm after the storm, Tally was shaken again, and Jane was as well, with the disappointment of being unable to slaughter all but a few in the room. Jane was thinking of taking on politics, coordination with the Turians and Earth, and what the hell was she thinking? She wasn't a politician, if it couldn't be fixed by guns or yelling. Take the win, Jane. Take the win and run. No time for self-doubt. Tally needs you. On the shuttle, Garrus was finally able to give in to the temptation to be closer than colleagues, and he stood next to Tally protectively until she turned into him. His arm closed around her shaken shoulders, and the heartbreaking crying of a daughter who had lost hopes and illusions when she found her father on the floor echoed through the shuttle. She watched with aching heart these two children who loved their fathers. She had nothing like that. Her parents were superior officers. She'd known them, respected them, but never loved them. They had never loved her back. They had approved or disapproved, not loved. All that had mattered was whether or not she passed inspection. In a way, she felt empty of those hopes and dreams and illusions, and better for it. In another way, she felt jealous. Not that they had each other, but that they had images of beloved parents at all. Jane had an empty space. Tally had an empty space that had once been filled. When Jane's father had died, she had not cried. Not like Tally. Nobody had leaned toward her. Not like Garrus. She had been self-contained and stoic, and people had inferred her grief in her quiet dignity, not suspecting that she hadn't lost a father because she'd never really had a father. She didn't speak because she had nothing to say, not because too many words crowded her lips to seal them. When they landed, she stepped closer to them, kissed the side of Tally's face mask, and pressed her forehead briefly to Garrus's crest, then left them both to shared grief and comfort. She supposed she should have some urge to speak to her mother, but she didn't. She had no hope of sparking love from human to human. Not the way a Taurian loved a Quarian. Not the way that Taurian loved a human or a Drell. Not in any way that made mother and daughter more than military colleagues, one with more seniority who would always outrank the other. She hadn't done something in a long while, and she felt like doing it now. Growing up in quarters, on stations and ships, had always been cramped, and she'd found comfort in humming floors, bright lights, and modular surroundings. She'd often built her own small fortresses out of all the detritus of abandoned storage and packing materials. It wasn't an unusual sight on the Normandy to see the commander straightening out crates, storage, stowing cables, because she had conditioning and an element of OCD on the subject. Crates got squared to parallel surfaces, cables were coiled neatly, and in this case, she was going to make herself a fort. She walked slowly across the shuttle bay and found a squared and sheltered alcove. She had only to move a few crates, throw a tarp over it, weigh the top down, make sure it was sturdy and stable. Her hands remembered, though she realized these hands had never been a part of it. This body had never built or been in a ship fort. With the space entirely draped and her feeling about 7 years old, with a silly grin she crawled in, her cheek to the cold and then warming metal of the deck, the living hum of the Normandy welcomed to reach her bones. Her quarters were too large, too exposed, and sometimes she needed to be enclosed, unseen, part of the landscape, part of the ship that was her life. The ships and stations she had lived on had been her family, and she remembered all their names, all their captains, with some reverence and awe. She remembered more warmly all the people who had been engineers and cooks and had had time to talk to an enthusiastic and curious little girl. It usually hadn't been the captains. Her parents did not take questions, only gave directives if they were there at all, which she dutifully obeyed. She loved the Normandy, and she couldn't feel her this strongly through the walls or floors of her cabin so far from the drive core. The cabin had been designed to be a haven from ship life, and in a way that was its only flaw. She'd read once a quote, and it had stuck in her head. Thomas Aquinas. If the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. She'd sailed from yet another port, and her ship was still preserved, and that was a miracle. She drew in air while rushing through space to the next port. Soon she would risk it all again, and hopefully come home to the same miracle. Here there was life encapsulated in the dark. Here there was purpose driving across incalculable spaces. She smiled and fell into her childhood meditation in that place where ship captains knew why their vessel was a she, was a mother, was a goddess that determined their fate. She was still in her hard suit, still splattered with geth, and that was good. She came fresh from battle to commune. She had her command, and she had her ship, and the Normandy would speak to her through the flaw, through vibrations and hum, and the throb that meant she was alive, her heartbeat, Mass Effect energy surging through her veins. She pulled off a glove and spread her fingertips over the deck, drawing in a deep breath with the sensation of the living ship moving through her hand, letting her breath back out slowly, finding a rhythm and pacing her breathing to it. She woke in the dark, surrounded by the warmth of trapped air, hand on the thrum of the deck, but her head was raised, and it took her a moment to remember where she was. Thane had slipped into her hiding place and joined her. Her cheek was resting on his thigh. She could tell first by scent, and then by the touch of skin on leather. She smiled in the dark. Her breathing pattern must have changed because his hand moved to sift through her hair, a light ruffle like a breeze. She didn't care how he found her, only that he did, and that he belonged. And she welcomed him. She didn't need to explain that this was her church, that these were her sacraments and blessings. He had Amonkira and Arashu, and she had Our Lady of the Living Deck. He would know without being told, and they could share sacred in silence, new rhythms of breath and muscle added to the song of the ship. He had never spoken of his parents, other than that he had been given to the Hana. He said he could have refused to serve, but when his parents gave him away at 6, she doubted that. He had empty space and duty for parents. He'd found his gods, and she'd found her goddess. A wish pulsed back down her fingertips, hoping the ship could hear her. I will take you from safe harbor through a gate from which none have returned. I will gird you in lightning and thunder and hope. Please, see us back home whole, victorious, and with your deck sound and alive under our feet. Amen. Eventually she had to pry herself out of her warm, companionable cocoon because she had to pee. Not terribly poetic, but oh well. Thane had sat in gentle stillness for untold time, and she had enjoyed the silence, flooded with gratitude for his company. He made no effort to move until she started to shift, and then her stomach growled so loudly that it was pretty clear church was out for now. She was stiff and cramped, but he maneuvered them out with his fluid movements, left the little fort intact and draped. She had geth ichor in her hair, and she probably had a distinct sleep seam on her face from lying against the leather on his thigh. But he looked at her as though she were beautiful, and she believed it in that moment. There was a raw and ragged beauty to what she did, just as there was a graceful and elegant beauty to what he did. His eyes moved to her lips and stayed there, and he drew a thumb over her lower lip, saying, I will bring a meal for you. She went to the cabin, lip tingling, and carefully removed and cleaned her armor. Good thing geth fluids weren't corrosive. She thought of Garrus and Tally and hoped they'd get time to bond, to explore their relationship. Jane hadn't taken Quarian lovers because she was terrified of making them sick. It seemed too high of a risk to take, but it was Tally's risk to take, not hers to judge. Tally and Garrus both had so much courage, had absorbed so much tragedy, taken so many steps together into darkness. Finding comfort in each other's arms could be a beautiful thing for both of them. Good luck, broken children of the larger-than-life. Cleaning was rote, but it did take checklist focus, and she tried not to let her mind wander too far. She quickly checked in with Edie in case there were emergencies requiring her attention, and contacted Joker and let him know their next port, which right now was the Citadel. As much as it wasn't her favorite place, there were reasons to go. She never asked Edie to transmit orders to Joker or to anyone. Too much mistrust of AI. Too convinced that Edie was the eyes and ears of the elusive man, knowingly or not. She wanted people to know that if Shepard wanted something, you'd hear it from her. She visited her crew, notified them all in person of missions, answered requests to see her as immediately as possible. The entire ship was a web, and she had to tend it, feeling her way, alert to each tremble and sway. The old saying, "The devil is in the details," applied to command. Become too reliant on another to assess a situation for you, and you lose your discretion and instinct. That was why she was found communing with deck plates, coiling cables, and talking to her crew so often that many of them told her, in essence, to fuck off and let them do their jobs. She didn't micromanage so far as telling people how to do their jobs, but she did web tend. If people were walking behind her, carrying guns, it was best if they didn't want to shoot her in the back. She had a good crew. She had an excellent crew. They only had a few more things to do before heading through the relay. They still had to get the IFF, but she wanted to wrap everything else up first. So much of everything she'd done had been on Cerberus' schedule. Right now she was going to take some time while she had it and store up for winter, like a squirrel sequestering her nuts. They were going to live through this fucking thing if it killed her. She straightened a data pad on her desk and took a shower. After her shower, she heard Thane enter, and there was some minor rattling and clinking, but he was probably trying to make noise so she could hear. Otherwise, he was so quiet that she often felt the urge to say, "He's standing right behind me, isn't he?" in general conversation, in the hopes that someday it will be true and become comedic rather than vaguely upsetting. She was afraid if she pointed out that she was unnerved by his silence, he'd do it more often. She employed iron discipline instead, not allowing herself to become startled. She couldn't shake the idea that he was slowly keeping track of each order she gave, each reaction he elicited from her, filing them and awaiting some day of reckoning. Which was silly because they didn't have that many days left for that sort of planning. He was observant and intuitive, and it was the exposed feeling of living under lights that could reveal her to her bones. She revealed things to him she didn't know about herself. He was careful, and that made her careful. Normally she barreled through, which could be proven by the fact that she tended to give the council shit at every encounter. She tried to speak truth to power. In his case, there was less speaking of truth because it would almost seem like an insult. He usually already knew. She had only met a few people in her life that caused her to reflexively alter her voice, alter the pace of her speech, the flow of her thoughts, in an attempt to harmonize with them. Thane had the most profound effect on her in that regard. Since her personality often revolved around blunt humor, doing without humor, or mostly without, was a challenge. He made her see herself, see through his eyes. She liked who she was with him. His formality and unspoken places allowed those in her to breathe, to stretch, to be shared. He didn't make her other than she was. He allowed her to express parts of herself she only otherwise experienced alone. He'd said he was bringing dinner for her, but he'd clearly made it himself. She saw the food first. This did not come out of the galley. A bowl of elaborately pared, diced, and dressed fruit? She didn't think he ate meat or drank alcohol. She had only ever seen him eat fruit or vegetables, and those spare. She turned further to see him, and she was suddenly, drastically, and permanently underdressed in casual all-purpose t-shirt and loose pants. She stopped and stared. If she was right, he was wearing Nonconsent. She'd only seen cloth like that behind glass or in photographs. Most pieces were lost to history. There had been a small creature, closest to a scorpion on Earth than anything else in comparison, that had lived on Rakana and spun a fiber into webs that they used to coax condensing water from the dawn air when woven over their nests in the cooler ground. They were called Seni. There had been a clan of Drell that learned how to raise them to create the colors and consistencies that were highest prized, and work those fibers into cloth. The creature, the cloth, and the clan all shared the same name. Tseni garb was worn only by those who earned them, not available for sale, only as a gift. Even royalty may not wear Tseni unless some great act beyond their duty caused them to earn the favor of the secretive and ultimately powerful clan that gifted them yearly, making their coin with lesser cloth. Tseni garb was awarded like Earth's Nobel Prize, but with more religious significance and unique craftsmanship. Tseni could never be worn by other than the intended wearer. After the death of the owner, they were considered holy but cursed, preserved as a relic of a house but never touched out of respect and superstition. It was believed an honored Drell would wear the spirit of the Tseni in the afterlife, and Kalahira herself would stalk anyone who dared to touch the Tseni of her blessed, as though the action of touching or wearing would dilute or borrow honor they had not earned. The tiny fibers were knotted and woven in ways that could mimic Drell skin, patches and voids and stripes, with other patterns woven throughout their background. This Tseni matched Thane's colors, proving they belonged to him only. The patterns were made of his green and black and red. In composition, it was made of bands of fabric varying in width. Over and through the texture of skin, there were stylized rivers and dunes and cloud. The bands were then woven together in strap pattern, molded over and suggestive of the muscle underneath. She'd never seen Tseni worn. Tseni were beautiful and alien behind glass, and still, but worn, the cloth seemed to have a life of its own, composed of light and breath and the shift of his body. It was sculpted and subtly iridescent, looking like savage armor that would turn any weapon. The Hanar must have rescued some of the Tseni clan, and the spinning creatures found out how to raise them off Rakana. Thane had done something in his service to earn this. Urem would have swooned. She was about to swoon. She tried to remember if she was supposed to know about Tseni or not. It was obscure knowledge. Urem had told her so many stories about Drell, and she didn't know if he'd made up the story to amuse her, or if he was spilling Drell's secrets, trusting to her discretion. She swallowed. History fell away, and after the initial shock of identification of the cloth, it was just Thane wearing it, and the full impact of his presentation and regard. A blush crept up her throat and down her cheeks. She struggled to not pluck at her peon's clothing and apologize for being unworthy. Raising her eyes to his, he looked as though he hoped he passed her inspection. Given her thoughts on passing inspection, that she always tried to do it, and that she didn't always succeed, her shock melted into admiration as she said, Give me some time to come up with some words to express how speechless you have made me. That earned her a suggestion of a smile and a subtle relaxation of his body and warmth in his eyes that made her knees weak. She told him, I believe I have just discovered that I am intensely shallow. His lips curved into a deeper smile and he arched a brow ridge, asking, And why is that? He seemed to have determined that she was not going to budge from where she was, and he walked over to her. She extended a hand, and he ignored it, lifted her and moved back to the couch, sitting down and settling her into his lap. The idea of crushing the fabric horrified her, and she tried to stand up, but he wouldn't allow it, tightening his arm around her waist. She said, This is beautiful fabric. I can't. You can, because it is mine, and I choose this. Choose what? That I snag a zipper on it? This is Thane fabric, Sia. It does not snag. It looks fragile, but it is not that easily drawn away from its nature. The weavers make it so. The opening to exercise her curiosity loomed, and she asked him, Where did you get it? He settled her back against the curve of his arm and looked at her face for a moment, his eyes softening. He gathered her hair and pulled it over her shoulder, smoothing the strands. I will tell you, but first tell me what about you is intensely shallow. You are beautiful. I know I should probably say handsome, but beautiful more often comes to mind. This clothing is... I still don't have words. It made me stop and stare. A less shallow person would take it in stride, I imagine. That you are as beautiful to me in any clothing or without it would be ideal. He raised a brow, nodded sagely, kissed at the side of her throat, then moved his mouth to her ear, where he said, Nonsense. It's not nonsense. I'm wearing unworthy clothing in the present company. He bit at her earlobe. Then feel free to remove it. You were raised to wear what you wear. I was raised to wear what I wear. I am a creature of formalities, and you are not. It would be shallow if you attempted to dress as I do in order to adopt a superior technique to which you were not born. I take it back. You're definitely the shallow one. I suppose I could have told you of the dress code, but perhaps I preferred an ambush, such as you are inclined. See? Adopting a superior technique. He shook his head while nuzzling her throat. No, Sia. I was raised to ambush as well. You are not a shallow creature. You are appreciative of effort, as am I. All right. I cede to your superior technique. Where did you get the clothes? He leaned forward and took the bowl off the table, put it in her hands so she cradled it in her lap. He lifted a piece of fruit in his fingertips, brought it to her mouth, and she took it, chewed, and fell newly in love. She tipped her head back and soaked in appreciation of sweet, sharp, hot, tangy, and tingling. The venom from his fingertips pulled into the fruit. I take it back. I'm shallow. I'm in love with fruit. Oh, what did you do? Did you rub that all over your body before cutting it up? He brought another piece to her mouth. She chewed contentedly, eyes closed. You occasionally lack poetry, Jane. True. That's why I need you. I am prosaic. You are poetic. I have perhaps had too much poetry, and I require occasional, undisguised truths. I need you as well, just as you are. He told her stories and fed her fruit from his fingertips, identifying the different pieces, answering all of her questions for once without evasion. He told her of the Tseni clan, exactly as Urim had told her. He invited her to stroke her fingertips over the cloth, to not be afraid of it, that it was sturdy and repelled stain. It held its shape, seemed to remember the form it had been given, and rebounded after bending or depression. He had to demonstrate that before she'd try it herself. He explained that it was formed and then cured into shape, not merely woven, a compound cloth of fiber and resin that polished and sealed. Even he didn't know the full technique because that was secret. It had been gifted to him by the Tseni through the henna for a service he did not disclose. She didn't ask. They were still prone to being eavesdropped upon here, and she didn't want to endanger him or press on his confidence further. He explained that the fruit had a cultural meaning as well. Each of the strains of fruit were difficult to find, and had been, even on Rakana, now only available through a few purveyors. The herbs were also rare, the dressing composed of, she got the impression, very expensive things. The tradition was to prepare each fruit into a particular shape, an act of devotion and precise knife skills. An imperfect piece was to be discarded. The dressing had a particular ingredient that dissolved venom into itself as an emulsion. It was often presented as a gift to a parent or a superior, from apprentice to master, a sign of devotion and of being willing to take the expense, risk, and time to prepare it. After that tradition had been around for hundreds of years, the recipe had been altered and adapted to lovers. He had carved the fruit with bare hands, mixing the dressing with fingertips, composing the fruit with his own venom mixed in, as an offering to her. She asked him, "What's the occasion?" He fed her the last piece of fruit, waited until she chewed and swallowed with a satisfied closing of her eyes. "My life, Sia. You have given me back my life." Her lips quirked in a skeptical smile. "You haven't gotten out alive yet. Don't thank me too soon." He ran his thumb over her lower lip. "Have faith, Sia. My people would call it a rightness, a signpost or omen. Miranda has conquered death once already, and she is aided by 2 others of equivalent genius. They believe they have found a way, with continued treatment and Kolyat's aid, to reverse the Keprals. They have had success with initial therapies of altering my existing blood with a method of plasmapheresis, and they hope that transplantation and genetic therapy of marrow will create a self-sustaining solution. My breath is already easier. As of yet, they cannot extend this cure to Aldrel, as apparently Kolyat and I are a lucky match, but the research may very well save not only my life, but those of many of my people. It was your inspiration that brought this to pass. That is the value of being prosaic." She was venom-blurred and happy, feeling a pure and unsullied victory, something rare in her experience. He wasn't angry at her. He had his life. Kolyat had helped. He wore Tseni to honor the occasion, made her food and fed her with his hands, cradled her in his arms, and love soaked into her from his voice and body. She relaxed, saying, "Good." It was really, really good. Unspeakably good. She was awesome. He was amazing. Venom tasted really good. She told him, "You must really like helpless women." He smiled, dipped his lips to hers. "I have never met one I couldn't make so. So perhaps I have no frame of reference. I like you in that state." She stroked her fingers over his frill. "You are hopelessly arrogant." He tilted his head. "It is not arrogance in this case. Simply fact." She grinned. "But you're not disagreeing that you're arrogant?" He lifted her from the couch. "I may be arrogant, but I am not foolish." She wrapped her hands around his neck. He carried her to the edge of the bed, sat and moved his hand to the side of her face. He looked at her for long, solemn moments, and she looked back, less solemn, dizzy and happy and acceptant. He brushed a fingertip lightly along her cheekbone and leaned in to kiss her. She must taste of fruit and joy, and she was happy to share that with him. She followed his lead as though blindfolded and trusting, her fingers trailing over the mythical cloth, the mythical man, assured by his words and his kiss and his faith that it would be all right, that she had made it so, and that his gods told him. She could believe it in that moment, borrowing that from him, allowed to share in something never intended for human ears or hearts. Tyramit was coursing through her, and he turned her to straddle him, with her sitting back on the middle of his thighs, enough space for her to see and explore the cloth. He set her hands on it, allowing her to trace her fingertips over the bands. With her altered vision, she imagined she was seeing the Tseni as it was intended to be seen, as it would be seen by a Tyramit-enthralled drill, the rivers coursing in their paths, the dunes blowing and resettling, the clouds forming into fanciful shapes not from the earth, new creatures and spirits. Her knowledge of Arcana provided for her to find the suggestions of shapes of alien fish and animals and birds in the river and sand and sky. They swirled into new life with his breath and movement and her passing fingers. He was the embodiment of what was good of Rakana at her best. He taught the rivers to flow in their courses. He was the foundation basin of the desert. He blew the dunes into sculpted forms. He held up her sky. He was the hope of his people, who had scattered like the sand dunes. She moved her fingers between the straps, finding his skin underneath, coaxing his hum from his chest and groans from his mouth. He was living history and art and beauty. This was the allure of service to Hanar training, to be the opportunity to pull Rakana's past into now, to honor her and her gods, to be the unchanging and imperturbable wearer of Tseni in the dark shades of deep forest and twilight. The beat of his heart under her fingertips was like drums in the deep Rakana jungle where the sun never met the forest floor. He watched her face as she explored the fabric, the stories writ deep in the weave. I come from an old people, Jane, from an exhausted planet. Many would say a failed people. We are but a few. We cling tightly to the only traditions that belong to us. For we have lost our home, lost our soul. That soul was invigorated into my blood as a child. I am not sorry it was done to me, that I am who I am. For that, discipline is now required of me. I am fully formed for this purpose, and no moment of preparation was wasted. I have worn these tseni only once, when they were gifted, and never since. I did not feel worthy to carry Rakana on my body. I set them aside. Now I see that Rakana is not gone. I have been carried forward into the greater rivers of the galaxy to find a child of a younger race, brash and hurried and honest. Through my eyes, Arashu has seen you as well. I wear this, Siha, for you. I have seen your strengths, and that you carry the hopes of your people, the hopes of all people. I see with old soul through new eyes. I wear them now to show you that the hopes of my people, those Drell who wait upon the far shores and anxiously watch to see if their people will be wiped from the slate forever, are alive in me. I wear them as my armor and my guide. I wear these to prove to you I am worthy, that I will not fail you. If there is to be only one Drell who fights with you, know that he is blessed by his people, blessed by Arashu, and guided to follow your path. You need no armor or transferred hope of your own. Your people are not broken or lost. You have youth and hope and strength, and I love you for it. He pulled her hands from under the straps and kissed each palm. He made her proud to be who she was, rough and unpolished and unpretentious in comparison. He did not wish to cut and mold her to be like him, nor would he attempt to be like her. Nothing need be added or taken away, only shared. She was assured, hungry, curious, and searching along the textures and tension he gave her. He set her hands down and slid his palms over her hips, moving the simple shirt up and over her head, capturing her chin in a hand and kissing her. She was focused on him, his mouth, her fingertips, anywhere she wanted to touch him. His hands returned to her hips, lifting her to turn her and slip off the pants she now appreciated for their ease of removal, turning her to sit with her back to his chest. The feel of the tseni natural and fitting, part of him. It didn't occur to her to make a choice, take it off him. That would be presumptuous. She had no intent of presuming. Tilting her head back against his shoulder, her hands along his outer thighs as his hands were on her breasts, his mouth at her throat, the sound of his hum in her ears and through her nerves. He rolled back into the side, taking her with him, pivoting once and landing with her stomach down, his thighs straddling her hips. His thumbs and palms pressed into the muscles along the side of her spine at her lower back and rolled up, then out, along her shoulders, testing her muscle tension and learning her skin. Tingling moved from where his hands passed. She had so much venom in her blood that it was like splashes of water in a pond. No longer a shock or a hunger. Another perfectly normal, mythical thing. One hand came to the back of her neck, and the other set to dig into her muscles painfully and deep, and she tried to rear back and turn over, but he held her down with his hips and his hand. He leaned forward and pulled her earlobe between his teeth, saying, "Be still, Jane. Your muscles are starved for air, for movement, and this will hurt. Breathe through the pain. Practice faith in me. Even aided by venom, his hands were still painful on freshly tender muscle, and she let out squeaks and hisses of breath when he dug in. She stopped trying to turn with a conscious effort, and he squeezed once at her neck in approval of her acquiescence. She tried to relax, but his hands returned to more deeply painful depths of need and prying at knots of tension buried in layers. She'd never been able to bear massage, always stopped and complained of too much pain, and she didn't actually trust him or have faith. It wasn't about his skill, it was about her body being the way it was, and she was accustomed to a certain level of pain and discomfort. She'd grown used to it, her only other option being painkillers, which she avoided. She was certain he was doing it wrong, and he was used to drill muscle. She was sensitive to pain, she pushed herself too far, she had things like skin weave. It was unwitting and unnecessary torture, but it endeared him to her that he could be so wrong about something, but so sure. It wouldn't last forever. She would pretend it felt better after a little while, and he would let up. A few minutes, or an hour, or 2 breaths, or a day later, she couldn't tell. She changed her mind as he changed her body. His strokes were brutal and demanding and unforgiving, leaving behind cramp and twitching and offended flesh. She had a few moments of howling panic as though wakened from sleep to a clenching and strident cramp in a calf, that pain that demanded you do something about it, anything about it, when there was nothing to do. Despite his admonition to hold still, she arched and tried to relieve the pain, but he ignored that and was only concerned with immobilizing where he was working, tingling and pain and the feel of scented cloth on her hips, unrelenting fingers that began to draw sighs instead of gasps, moans instead of hissing breath. She groaned against a long press of his palm, saying, "No, one day you're gonna be wrong, and I'm gonna be there to see it, and I'm gonna laugh." He leaned in. "I have often been wrong, Sia. Can you tell me when? Right now?" His hands gripped her waist, scented cloth pressed to her back. She tried to think about it, but right now, all she could produce was a as her back turned traitor and felt like it was beginning to breathe, angry and unexpected, newborn and intensely grateful to be alive. She became progressively more and more boneless, made of light and air, that sense again that he saw straight through her skin, to her hollow bones and obeying muscle, into her mind to see her needs she didn't know she needed, wants that didn't come with the words to ask for them. She had always seemed a difficult, if not impossible, puzzle to people, secure in her oddities and strangeness, a puzzle nobody could solve. And he flipped and turned and folded her into origami, showing he knew not only her simpler forms, but the potential in his hands to be more complicated. She was in love, and she was, rightly, terrified of the man. She was cautious, but she knew not cautious enough. His allure making up the difference. It was too late to hide, too late to not be known. He had found her in her childish and solitary fort, understood and joined her there. If she were to become more cautious and keep any distance, he would obliterate that with concealed impatience. It was far too late to shut him out, and he knew it. She could do this the hard way, or the harder way. She would do it his way. He was whole, expecting to live, and he was her sworn instrument and weapon until he wasn't. She couldn't trust him, couldn't have faith, any more than she could have believed that he would bring her back to bliss. But time would take care of that. Her life belonged, in part, to him. Certainly her command did. Hadn't he earned the right to betray her? She drifted in and out of awareness of his hands, his breath, his thighs. Her thoughts like a rambling river, each bright or terrifying thought buoyed up for lazy examination. Intuitive realities and fantasies slipping by without her reaching for them. Each moment was perfect, arresting in its clarity or concealment. She was doomed. It was lovely to be doomed with style. The fear of losing him was replaced by the fear of keeping him, and what that would mean. How he would overshadow and eclipse her, how he would inspire her, how she wouldn't want it any other way. His hands eased and she barely noticed their presence, drifting like she was falling asleep on the beach, the awareness of waves falling out of her consciousness. She might have fallen asleep. Whispers of his voice, unintelligible but reassuring. Strokes of his hands on her body, comforting as they should be. She only started to become aware of change when she couldn't remember when he'd left her, how he'd removed his clothing, how they were under blankets. She was on her side, and his mouth was on hers, his hands gentle and still soporific. Urgency, a faraway hum, beginning in his bones and building outward, as he'd relaxed her from the skin and down in reverse, bringing her back to him, along with him. Her arm was relaxed on her hip, slowly straightened as she dug her fingernails into the skin of her thigh. The sense of feeling full of pleasure with a limit expanded and burst, and she was a fountain, no measured depth and no end to expression. His hands moved under and over her sides, settled on her hips and pulled her against his thighs, hips and cock, with a gushing moan from her lips and an answering growl from him. The urgency spread from his bones and through his muscles into hers. His hand slid down her thigh and pulled her bent knee over him, angling his body tighter to hers, so his cock was trapped against her stomach, hard and throbbing, his hand sliding back up the inside of her thigh and finding her clit, insistence in every part of him. His mouth bruised hers, teeth at her tingling and tender lips, fingers between her thighs, thrusting and sliding, wet and tingling at her clit, his cock sliding over her belly, slick with sweat and drops of pre-cum, the creature whose arms she was in, moving from myth to man to animal in choreographed movements. She came at his call with a wrenching moan against his mouth, shudders through her body. He growled in satisfaction, pressed her with his body over and down until he was hilted in slick heat, still and now newly clenching and welcoming him with a strangled scream from the weight of his body and the wrench of his arms on her legs. He held still, eyes closed, breath heaving, muscles twitching on his face. He let out a deep breath on a half snarl, moved her legs until her hips were lifted, legs braced against his chest and shoulders. He pressed down on her shoulders with the palms of his hands, drove in at a painful angle, withdrew, and did it again, ecstatic tension on his face, and the nails digging into her shoulders. She had a moment where she saw through to his bones, with renewed marrow, saw to his mind with its need and secrets, understood him and welcomed and cherished him before he ground into her with a snap and twist of his hips, a full snarl on his lips. Her head fell back, her eyes closed, her strangled wail provoking him to drive in faster, harder, deeper, until she repeated the sound, until she could make no other sound. She came around him, opened her eyes to see his head thrown back, feeling the trembling in the hands gripping her shoulders, shaken all through him, his face drawn tight with effort, and then releasing to pleasure with his final hard thrust inside, emptying and shuddering. He was still, panting, and then he opened his eyes, looked at her like she made the world. He eased her legs to the side and shifted his trembling arms to bear some of his weight, until he had lowered himself down enough to rain kisses along her shoulders and collarbone and neck, then rested his head above her breast, head to the side, his panting slowing, and she was sure he could hear her heartbeat. She reached weak arms to embrace him around wide shoulders, her palms flushed to the skin on either side of his spine.